With all the attention being paid over the last couple of days to the impending government shutdown and the continuing resolution that will keep the government open and whether or not it's going to pass and which Democrats in the Senate are going to support it and which aren't, all of which is very important and it deserves to get the attention that it's getting. But with all of that attention being paid to that, I did not want to overlook a related issue that also pertains to government funding, not the overall budget of the government itself, but to government funding of particular programs, and specifically when it comes to school lunch programs for public schools here in the United States. And this was the subject of an exchange a couple of days ago on CNN. I'm going to play a clip of it for you now. The primary participants in this exchange, the two guys who are going to be arguing with each other for most of this clip, are Kevin O'Leary and Bakari Sellers. So let's take a look at the clip.
I think Elon's not cutting enough. Cut 20% more now. Get your spreadsheet out. These are the names. Whack everybody, and then 20% more, as we do in the private sector every day and have done for 100 years in private equity, and hire back when the organization gels. That way, the demoralization only happens once. You don't want to cut multiple times. More whacking. Let me just,
can I explain to you that this is when running...
You don't need to explain it to me. I know how it works.
No, you don't, because
Actually, I do. I've done it multiple times.
But yeah, that's in the private sector. And you cannot run...
This is worse than private sector.
You cannot run everyday government the same way you run the
fat dripping with waste government.
I'm not talking about fat dripping with waste government.
What do we have?
What if I told you in the South right now in red states? Do you know the number one cause?
What does this have to do with red or blue?
Can I finish my question? Do you know the number one cause for children underperforming in schools right now?
Bad educators.
No, hungry. As a
No. Let me finish.
You're talking to the wrong guy. My whole career was in education.
That's my point of bringing that up to you.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you had things like the free and reduced lunch program. You had the summer lunch program.
Yes.
You had programs that were expanded so kids could actually. So I'm not arguing with you about your expertise in the private sector, but what I am saying is that a 20% cut or whack, you're cutting from Allendale Fairfax High School and Birmingham High School.
Okay.
You're cutting from places that really matter.
You want to talk about high schools in America? That's what I did for 14 years.
First of all, when Kevin O'Leary says there, I worked in education for 14 years and I worked in American high schools and I know all about this, you don't have to tell me about how education works. I think what he's referring to is the fact that he founded a software company called SoftKey that in the 90s also acquired some other software companies like MEC and the Learning Company that produced and marketed educational software to schools. So just for the record, that is what Kevin Leary is referring to as his experience in education, selling educational software to schools. What strikes me about that clip is how Bakari Sellers and Kevin O'Leary are clearly arguing about two completely different things, and it illustrates the philosophical and ideological differences between the right and the left on this issue and on many, many other issues as well. When Kevin O'Leary says you should cut more than you intend to cut, you should decide what you need to cut and then go ahead and cut 20% more. Because when you're cutting over and over and over again, it's demoralizing. It's bad for morale. So you should just cut a lot one time. There is a certain bloodless, soulless, pure capitalist logic to that, right? He's saying if you are running a company and you need to make cuts in order for the company to continue operating or to be more profitable or so that the executives can give themselves raises at the expense of the workers or whatever, it's better to make a big cut one time than to make repeated little cuts, because the repeated cuts will just demoralize the employees and it will ultimately hurt the company more in the long run than if you just do one big cut. But he's talking about doing that, applying that philosophy to the government, and specifically in context of these cuts that have recently been announced by the USDA. The USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has recently announced that it's going to cut over $1 billion worth of funding to programs that were designed to allow public schools to make local food purchases for their school lunch programs. And this is the context in which Kevin O'Leary is saying they should make these cuts and then cut 20% more because you got to cut more than you think you need or else it's bad for morale. He's looking at it like a business. And a lot of Republicans, pretty much every Republican, looks at government as though it should be run like a business. And you even see Kevin O'Leary presuming to tell Bakari Sellers, a former actual elected official in government, how government should be operating with this because he has all this private equity, private sector experience. And I know about having to cut things and you don't even know, right? And Bakari Sellers, with far more patience, even though he raises his voice and tries to break in and talk over Kevin O'Leary a couple of times there, displaying far more patience than I ever would in that situation, is trying to explain to Kevin O'Leary this, in this context, fucking clueless business guy who has no idea how government operates nor how government should operate. He's trying to explain to him, when you cut and then you say, let's go ahead and just cut 20% more from programs that are created to benefit people, not to sell products, not to earn a profit, but to benefit people, the effect of those cuts will be felt by real people. And in this case, in the case of these programs, by the most vulnerable people, and also by people that Republicans generally at least like to pretend that they're on the side of. That $1 billion that the USDA announced it was going to cut from food programs that were designed to allow public schools to buy food for their school lunch programs and their free and reduced lunch and breakfast programs, whatever they were going to use the food for. Most of that $1 billion was going to end up in the hands of farmers because that's who they're buying the food from. It's not just a program designed to subsidize school lunches for public school students. It's also subsidizing farmers and local food banks because those are the people, those are the sources that the schools are going to take that money and buy the food from. So you're not just hurting public school students who, as Bakari Sellers correctly points out, in many cases could go hungry as a result of this because the program through which their school was buying food for them is now going to be slashed. It's also hurting the people who were selling the food to the schools. But let me back up, because what I really want to talk about, and this goes back again to this philosophical difference between Republicans and Democrats, between people on the right and people on the left, it's this idea that students, and through the students, their parents, because in most cases, especially with younger children, I mean, most school kids below a certain age don't have jobs, aren't working, aren't earning their own money. So when they pay for their school lunches, they're paying through their parents, like their parents are giving them the money. Many of these people are low-income households. They don't have a lot of money to spare. But even if that is not the case, I have long thought that it is completely ridiculous that public school students are charged for their lunch at all. There are programs there in most public schools, there certainly were in the public schools that I attended, where there is what's called a free or reduced lunch program, where if a student comes from a household that has a household income below a given level, they qualify for free or reduced lunch, which means they either don't have to pay as much to buy their lunch at lunchtime in the cafeteria as other students do, or if their household income is below the lowest applicable level, they don't have to pay for it at all. They get it for free. And it is subsidized through funding, through state and federal programs that pay for those lunches so that the students and the students' parents don't have to pay for them. And my proposal is that that should just be the way it is for everybody. No student, regardless of their household income, who attends a public school should have to pay for their lunch. I'm saying If they want to pack their own lunch, if they want to bring their own food from home, that's great. They should be allowed to do that. But if they go to the cafeteria for lunch and their intention is to eat the food that has been prepared for them at the school by the cafeteria workers and is being served that day for lunch, they should just be able to fucking eat it. They shouldn't have to pay for it. They shouldn't have to buy it. And there are a couple of reasons, which I think are very good reasons why I believe this. One reason is, again, to go back to what Bakari Sellers tried to say in that clip I played, hunger does affect education. If a student is hungry, or if a student is living with food insecurity in general, that is inevitably going to affect their ability to learn and be a good student and get the most out of their education. If you are not hungry, or you are not going to have to worry about where your next meal is coming from because you know you have a guaranteed lunch waiting for you at school that you are not going to have to pay for, and you or your family are not going to have to go into debt in order for you to get it, with school lunch debt, which is another whole fucking dystopian thing that is related to this that should not exist in this fucking country or anywhere else, but I happen to live in this country and happen to have been born in this country, and it's a fucking disgrace that in the great and powerful United States of America, there's such a thing as fucking student lunch debt. But anyway, if a student at a school doesn't have to worry about that, if that is, pardon the pun, off their plate, then their performance in school, their ability to make the most of their education will be that much better, will be that much easier. But that's not the only reason. In fact, the main reason for me that I believe that all student lunches should be free is purely a philosophical one. It's, we should feed them. We as the public, we should subsidize this through our taxes, through our government that in theory represents us and carries out our will. We should pay for those students to eat so that it doesn't have to come directly out of their pocket because we force them to go. They have to go to school. Legally, they have to go to school. And as long as they are legally forced to go to school, I think it's only right that we provide them a lunch, since we're saying they have to go. They don't have a choice. Now, they can opt out and say they're going to get homeschooled, or they can choose to attend a different kind of school, a private school or something like that, but they are legally mandated to go to school in some way. And most people choose to go to public school. And by the way, I'm 100% in favor of public school. I'm not in favor of homeschooling. I really have kind of a shitty attitude toward private schools as well. I'm a big fan of public school. I think public education is a great thing. It is a public good. You can't, Kevin O'Leary's talking about in that clip, all of the dripping fat from federal government, all of the waste. You cannot convince me you could ever waste money spending it on public education in this country. We spend way less money on public education at the state and federal levels than we should. There is no such thing as too much money that you could spend on public education in this country, as far as I'm concerned. Give public schools all the money you can give them. They will find something to do with it. Teachers and administrators in public education will find something to do with it productive that will help students. And the idea that we force students to go to school, and most of them go to public schools, and we don't feed them as a part of that. We're saying, by the way, you have to go. You have to go to school unless you are one of the relative few who go to who are homeschooled by their parents, or who attend a private school. If you are one of the vast majority of school-age kids in this country who attends public school, you have to go. But by the way, you also have to pay for your own lunch. What the fuck is that? It's just fundamentally unfair. It's fundamentally wrong. I'm not against forcing kids to go to school. I agree completely that kids should be legally required to go to school. I am not against that whatsoever. It's for their own good, and it's for the good of our entire country. An educated populace is a good thing that we should all want. And anybody who ever expresses doubt or suspicion or lack of commitment to that idea, anyone who isn't 100% on board with the idea of having an educated population is someone who should immediately be suspicious to you. There is no legitimate reason why anybody would be less than 100% behind the idea of a fully educated population in this country. Anybody who wants to not have educated people in this country is up to no good. So I am 100% in favor of compulsory public education. But since we do that, and since we should do that, since we are doing that, since kids don't have a choice but to go to school, it seems like the least we can do while we're forcing them to go to school and get educated is to feed them and not to force them or their parents to pay for their food directly out of their own pocket. And it's really funny how most of the people who balk at that are the people who have way too much money already, like Kevin O'Leary. The guy who's up there as a venture capitalist, as a private equity guy, as a guy who has made his fame and fortune on being the guy who has the money that invests money in other people's stuff. He's the guy with the money. That's the whole basis of the only reason you know his face or know his name, because he's one of the guys with the money. And isn't it funny how it's always the guys with the money and the guys with more money than they could ever need or use in their entire lives. And they're the ones who are always saying, the government spends too much money. Even when it's the government spending money on kids or on farmers or people that, again, conservatives pretend that they are boosters for and champions for. It's always the Kevin O'Learys that are saying, government just spends too much money. The government should really spend less money, say the people with all the money. There's an old saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I find it very, very telling indeed that so often the people who say that are the ones who have never, ever, ever had to worry about where their next lunch is going to come from.